Hello and welcome to our viewers all around the world. It's People, Politics and Power. I am Imonia Marere. The 15th summit of the BRICS group, made up of Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, has ended in Johannesburg, South Africa. The summit expectedly focused on issues of trade and investment facilitation, sustainable development, innovation, global governance reform, global geopolitics, and infrastructure development. In Johannesburg, the alliance sought to expand its membership as 40 countries reportedly submitted intentions to join. At the end of the three-day summit, only 6 were admitted to bring the number of members to 11. They include Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, UAE. The value of BRICS, as stated by its founders, is a shared commitment to restructuring the global political, economic, and financial architecture to make it fair, balanced, and representative on the pillars of multilateralism. Simply put, BRICS seeks to counter the economic dominance of the West and change the structure of international economic relations. And one way of doing this for them is to alter the global financial trading system by creating an alternative to the dollar. The BRICS group is said to account for more than 42% of the world's population and covers 30% of the world's territory. It represents 23% of the global economy and 80% of its trade. There are, however, those who argue that the alliance is a platform for the further dominance of the global south by the developed economies of Russia and China especially, and those countries that are seeking new territories and markets for conquest and exploitation in the less developed countries of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and as a counterforce to the global north with this group of 20 economic powers. On the program today, we shall be carrying out a post-mortem of the Johannesburg Summit and its implications for African states, many of whom were among the 67 countries invited as observers to the summit. My guest analysts are already here. Dr. Rasigan Maharaj is the founding director, Institute for Economic Research on Innovation at the Tshwane University of Technology in South Africa. He is also the chairperson, Southern African Node of the Millennium Project. He is joining us virtually from Johannesburg. Thank you, Dr. Maharaj, for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to also engage on this very important topic.
Very great to have you. And right here in the studio, we have Adakole Ijogi, an economist, and is joining us here, like I said, right here in the studio. Mr. Ijogi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, to set the tone for our discussion, let's take a listen to this report, a special report on the BRICS Summit by our correspondent, Utibe Umora.
The BRICS Summit in South Africa is kicking off at a time the world is in a tumultuous political situation and global economic uncertainties. Russia, a key member of the BRICS, is still in an armed conflict with its neighbor Ukraine and facing tons of economic sanctions from the West. China, its major political ally, is seen as an economic threat to the United States, Russia's main political adversary. South Africa, India, and Brazil, on the other hand, have been longtime allies of the United States, but the BRICS Pact may not only create contradictions in that relationship, but upend it. South Africa, for instance, has been under pressure from the United States prior to the decision of Russian President Vladimir Putin not to physically attend the summit amid calls for his arrest for war crimes by the International Criminal Court, ICC. Putin will be attending virtually, represented by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. So what really is the economic agenda of the BRICS? Primarily, an economic order that is more balanced against the dominance of the Western-controlled G7. Battered by sanctions from the G7, Russia is hoping to use the influence of BRICS to whittle down the dominance of the United States and advance an economic order that will be more beneficial to its interest. To put things in context, the combined GDP of the 5 BRICS countries is about $26.03 trillion compared to the overall GDP of the G7, which is $45.9 trillion according to a 2023 data by research group Statista. At country level, the United States alone, which is the dominant player in the G7, has a GDP of $25.46 trillion as at 2022, while China, the world's second largest economy and the biggest bull in the BRICS, holds a GDP of $17.96 trillion according to 2022 World Bank data. What this data means is that the BRICS may still have some catching up to do to create the new economic balance they are seeking for. However, that process could speed up, with about 40 nations seeking to join the BRICS. Among the countries is Africa's largest economy, Nigeria, and 6 other African countries, along with countries from the Middle East, including heavyweights, Saudi Arabia and Iran, backed by their massive oil wealth. For Africa, the BRICS Summit is of huge significance as the continent seeks new economic realignment. Experts in African affairs and diplomacy believes that the continent's strategic interests will be more realizable in a world order where the continent has more than one suitor or partner. Ambassador Usman Saraki, a former deputy permanent representative of Nigeria to the United Nations in New York, explains.
The significance lies in the fact that today the global economy cannot do without the BRICS. In terms of investment, in terms of finance, in terms of food production, in terms of commodity trading and raw materials production and consumption.
It is also significant that an African country is hosting the 2023 summit, the first fiscal summit since the COVID-19 pandemic. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa described it as representing a common desire to have a more balanced global order.
He said BRICS for Africa. So he wants to see African membership, increasing beyond South Africa, to expand the vistas of that grouping in order to increase its relevance and its impact.
Where does Africa fit into the overall objective of the BRICS?
For instance, if more African countries join, a formal structure of market access into Chinese market, Russian market, for instance, will be established through the mechanism of BRICS.
While the agenda of the 2023 BRICS is yet sketchy, the bloc is expected to discuss the financing and lending within the BRICS Bank, formerly known as a New Development Bank, which was established in 2015, and how to stem the impact of foreign exchange fluctuations. Other areas include increased economic cooperation and the expansion of the bloc to include more members seeking to join. One thing is sure, the West will be closely monitoring the 2-day BRICS Summit and its outcome, and how it will impact already existing international diplomatic trade ties and alignment.
All right, a special report by our correspondent to Tibel Moren says the tone for our discussion. And let me come to you straight away, Dr. Rasigan Maharaj, right here in South Africa. You of course, witnessed the summit, the 15th summit of the BRICS, which has just ended. Now, so give us a sense of what it was like for South Africa, the only African country that was a member of that group until the summit, to host that summit. Give us a sense of what it was like.
I think it's quite important also to share with the listeners what we've seen take place in this week itself, and the summit ending today has really been a symbolic event. It's quite important recognizing that, because the work of the BRICS, the countries that constitute BRICS itself, has been ongoing across 15 years, and more specifically in the run-up to this summit itself, a whole range of issues, including the economy, including issues of those wanting to join with the BRICS, etc., has been voiced and substantively engaged with. That's been through working groups and a whole process that runs in parallel to the summit itself taking place. I think it's quite important in terms of recognizing, in terms of how South Africans would have viewed this. And that is, we are faced with a huge number of escalating problems itself, starting from the lack of electricity through to the quality of our drinking water itself being under threat at present. So these are the material issues that ordinary South Africans are confronted by. And we are looking towards engaging with the countries of Brazil, Russia, India, and China in helping us also resolve these acute problems. Towards that end, many of the statements made by the heads of state of the countries visiting for BRICS itself have made very positive statements about how they would directly be contributing to resolving South Africa's problems. So to that end, the South African population was given a sense of how the collaboration and cooperation amongst the BRICS holds the potential of resolving domestic challenges itself. At the same time, we do have the sentiment that does arise, which remains important for us to bear in mind. This was a meeting of the governments of the 5 countries. But as your report presents, and as you yourself have introduced, the BRICS also are constituted by the largest block of human beings. Of the 8.1 billion of us that constitute the human population on the planet, the larger proportion reside within countries of BRICS as opposed to the G7. So this then affords us also the opportunity to join with others in responding against the perpetuation and continuation of unequal exchange that relegates huge countries like Nigeria, strong countries such as Egypt and South Africa, etc., to the periphery of the world system. And increasingly, we need to be responding to that at the people-to-people level, not just government-to-government level. I hope this expresses some of the key issues being raised.
Definitely, Dr. Asenga. Like you have clearly identified, the problems and challenges you have identified domestically for South Africa are very true, or almost the same with what happens in almost every African country today. Now, flowing from that, how relevant would you then say that BRICS is to the rest of Africa? Those who are not members, now we have just admitted 2 African countries, Egypt and Ethiopia, as members now. There now is an 11-member organization, and only 3 African countries are there. So how relevant, how is BRICS going to be relevant to the developmental needs on the African continent?
I think, as you express it itself, it's a key concern for all of us Africans that we must really take much more seriously as well. We are a continent of over 1.1 billion people. But as the colleagues would, I'm sure, be aware, I said that under proviso, we aren't even sure about the exact number of people that reside on our continent itself. We have very poor statistical systems, and we need to do much to improve that for us to even know the numbers involved itself. So it's a positive statement in terms of the first countries from Africa that have been invited in. But I take the view that maybe the BRICS, the 5 countries constituting BRICS, were not only taken by surprise, but also overwhelmed by the huge appetite that seemed indicative from the applications for membership itself, and therefore was unable to cater for everyone in this round itself. It's also quite important in terms of bearing in mind that when this grouping operates, it does continue to operate discreetly. It is not constituted as a singular bloc as yet. Because of this, there are many dynamics that take place within the countries, even within the 5 countries, that don't find expression collectively as the BRICS. In other words, there are differences within the domestic situations in Brazil, inside Russia, in India, very spectacularly, within China and within South Africa itself. I'm trying to express a view that the BRICS, even though its stated objective is a fairer world system, a more equal system, unfortunately remains under the yoke of the constructs of global capitalism. Capitalism as a system itself is premised on inequality. So you cannot end up with a fairer, unequal system. And it's important that we bear that in mind as well. The contradictions of capitalism are embedded within the alliance that constitutes the BRICS. And because of that, also we see the inability to completely de-link and suggest an alternative path. What has been of huge importance to us, however, is the growing confidence in confronting the hegemon, specifically the United States of America, and the manner in which the reserve currency, specifically the US dollar, has been weaponized and is applied against at a very selective level. You know, I heard mention of the countries of West Asia, and it's very important we reorientate our compass, and I make this statement broadly. There's no Middle East to us in Africa. If we talk the Middle East, we're talking about the Great Lakes or Burundi. When we talk about West Asia, we are talking about an area designated as a playground violently for global powers itself. And we must break away from that. We need to be constituting on the basis of our own identity, our own pathway forward that links together our indigenous societies, our traditional knowledges, and redresses, I hope colleagues don't mind this very big word, epistemicide, the way in which our ways of seeing the world were extinguished when we were incorporated into world systems. I hope all that are participating in this show recognize we were not incorporated on the basis of being equal. We were incorporated in subordinate positions. And the institutions generated, especially after World War II, the Bretton Woods arrangements, etc., have merely served to perpetuate and enhance that negative, that subsidiary position for Africa, our entire continent. We are the source of all humankind, yet we are the most marginalized in world systems today. So it's a big task ahead of us. And I think BRICS at least offers us some transport along that route, seeking to redress such inequities.
All right, let me bring in Adakole Jogi, who is right here with me in the studio. Mr. Jogi, you heard Dr. Maharaj say that BRICS appear to be that platform that will bring the African continent, the developing world, the global south into the mainstream of the global economy. Is that your interpretation and assessment of what BRICS is?
Yeah, he essentially shared my views, the opinions that I hold with regards to world economics. You know, it's essentially Western dominated. The way that the world economies are structured, it is unfair to emerging economies, especially in Africa. Some of us have always asked this question, that since Africa has close to 47% of the total resources and wealth of the world, how come Africa is the poorest? Real resources, it's not out there, it's not in Europe, it's not in America, but most of it is here in Africa. And yet, the currency valuation systems we economists use, the purchasing power parity use in exchange, Africans, our currencies, like 1,000 of denomination of our currencies exchanges to the dollar. And we know that the dollar is not backed by anything. The dollar is not backed by gold. It's not backed by commodities. So what these BRICS countries are trying to do, essentially, for now, is commodity exchange. And I think that Africa must take a leaf from them. I mean, we have the African Continental Field Trade Agreement. I like the structure in the one in West Africa that is economic communities, because it's about the economy, it's about our livelihood. I think we should borrow a leaf instead of waiting to queue up to join the BRICS nation, which will essentially be wonderful. Because when you look at the statistics, like they reeled out at the jump of this program, it's essentially will benefit Africa, for me, in technological exchange, because we have the resource. So, and you have huge economies, like the second largest economy in the world, 19-point-something billion US dollars, that's China. And then you now have India also, that is also technological advance, and then you now have Russia. Now, when I was looking at the figures, if you put the 11 countries together, their GDP size is impressive. If you put the 11 economies together, their GDP size is about 37% of the world's GDP. If you take the ones that are oil-producing countries, China produces about 5-point-something million barrels per day, Russia about 12-point-something million barrels. But if you put all of that together, they control about 42% of oil production. And you know, our reliance on fossil fuels and carbon, this thing is not going away anytime soon. We'll still be relying on fossil fuels as we try to power our economies. So I think that for Africans, while it is good, Egypt and Ethiopia have joined, I think that more African countries should join. But I think the emphasis should be on technological advancement. We should learn their technologies, while we also try to put in good governance systems within our individual countries. And for me, like I think the president of Kenya, who said that the over-dependence on the dollar is what is impoverishing African nations. And that if, like a country like Nigeria now wants to trade with Ghana, why would we have to use dollars? So what this brings, I hope that they come up with that I know to find a single currency like the euro for the BRICS nations will be something that will be in future. I mean, I don't see it happening anytime soon, but let us start with commodity trading. When Nigeria wants to trade with South Africa, why are we looking for dollars? We can have a system a commodity exchange system that we can, So I think that the emphasis, of course, we know world trade is not just and fair. I think that with this we can have a fairer world trade, because no country lives in isolation. We must deal with other countries. We must first, as Africans, as a bloc, and say, look at our comparative advantage. South Africa, you have uranium. Nigeria, we have lithium. The world is moving towards using those natural resources to power economies. How are we going to get a fair price for them? How are we going to relate with each other? I think that those are the essential things that will come out of this BRICS alliance that we have currently.
You have just talked about or placed a lot of emphasis on technological exchange.
Yes.
Which would, in your view, benefit a lot of the African countries.
Yes, sir.
Now, but how do you address the concerns and fears of those who say, look, this might just be another trap? The West has always brought in obsolete technology. Technology that has been discarded in the Western world is brought and dumped on Africa. So where is the guarantee that China and Russia or India will not do that same part in the guise of technological
exchange? Well, I like what Dr.
Maharaj,
he just hit on about these Brentwood nations who started after the Second World War and created all these institutions, IMF and World Bank and stuff like that. To be fair to these countries in BRICS, actually there was someone from Goldman Sachs, I think Jim O'Neill, who set it up in 2001. So he's still part of all these international players. But to be fair to them, China never participated in trading of Africans. Neither did Russia participate. In that country, in that German something that they have in 1886, where they divided Africa, Germany, Russia wasn't there. even though Russia is a European country. The same goes with India. They didn't participate in slavery and butchering Africa and cutting away resources and stuff like that. So it's better for us to deal with them because they never dehumanized Africans. They never saw us as commodities or looked at our continent as where they come to exploit and plunder. That is Russia, China, and India. So I think that we can trust them to that extent. But with the way the world is going right now, that you have social media, as even though some of us disagree that there's nothing social about it, it is personal broadcast media. Everybody's broadcasting. So we need the modern technologies because the information is out there and we're sharing. So they are not only giving, we too are also giving. It's an exchange because Africa is endowed with natural resources. All we need to fix is our governance systems, and then we get a little help. Like he spoke about the what you call it, the power outages in South Africa, just like we have here in Nigeria. We've been struggling to build Ajakuta in the last 45 years, the steel company in Kogi State. So we have those challenges. Our refineries are moribund. We have 3 refineries that are not working. We have to be importing petroleum products. So we just need to need a little leg up. And Africa, we have a fairer economy. The world will be fairer, better for us to live in because we're all belong to one global family. So the difference between the haves and the haves not is widening. That's why you have all this distress around Africa, especially in the West African bloc. 4 countries are under military regime. We prefer democracy. We prefer to elect our leaders. But when you have this economy biting harsh, people just have to react. And I think that the global players, the G7 countries, are not being fair to Africans and other parts of the world. Because if, like I mentioned, the dollar is not backed by anything, and the dollar is the world's reserve currency. So you can't develop in those kind of models, those kind of exchange systems that they've put around, the financial system that they've put around in the world. It is skewed to favor the G7 countries. So I think that this other route created by the BRICS nations and the ones that have just joined, that will be joining in January 2024, I think is a good way to go. Okay. So as we can de-dollarize world economic financial systems.
Dr. Maharaj, let me come to you. The BRICS talks about inclusive multilateralism, and as you have heard from Mr. Ijogi, he hopes that there will be a lot more of technological exchange between and among members of the BRICS. Now, my question is, what will Africa be bringing to the table other than its raw materials? There are those who believe, rightly or wrongly, that what the 3 big powers, or 5 big powers of 4 of the 5 big powers in BRICS, talking about Brazil, India, Russia, and China, are looking for are the raw materials in Africa to feed their industrial complexes back home.
So I think it's important, as Professor Georgie has already mentioned as well, I'm very much aligned with the comments that he's made. You know, it's important us recognizing all our systems, all our development, our entire 13 million years as a species. You know, we coexisted with other hominids for a long time. 200,000 years of our history as anatomically modern human beings, and then our history since the last ice age, has shown us our common humanity. But it remains an absolute paradox of this 21st century of the common era, that we have resources that we are willing to put into showrooms to showcase expensive vehicles while people sleep on the street outside such facilities. And that's a point that we need to bear in mind as well. We need to also uplift our own discussion and argument. We need to incorporate the notion of socially useful labor and what it is that we expend our economic prowess on. It's not just that we are in deficit, colleagues. It's important us recognizing we are over 1.1 billion as a continent of Africans. Within this, we have a huge diversity of competences, of capacities, and capabilities. It's absolutely critical for us to continue building our own scientific and technological capacities, capabilities, and competences such that we no longer remain the exporters of raw materials in unfinished form, such that we import back into our countries those same raw materials, now with value addition and at a higher cost. These are things that we really need to pay much more attention to. I want to also, maybe with your permission, pick up on a point that Professor Georgie has raised. And that is, it's not only that the dollar is not backed by gold or anything physically tangible underneath it. We, collectively, the world, is subsidizing America's consumption. Why? Because America has the largest debt in the world, and it's us that are maintaining their debt situation by continuing to trade using their currency. You know, it remains shocking to me, and I know this from the work I've done in West Africa as well, colleagues, that from Nigeria, you're exporting crude and importing petrol. You know, this cannot be as we go ahead, notwithstanding it's an age we're leaving behind. But there are a range of other possibilities that we've not explored because of this. Who says that crude oil can only equal petroleum? There are a range of other products, especially as we decarbonize. This needs our thinking, colleagues. It needs to be a source of what we also are liberating, which is our sovereignty of thought. I raise this primarily because we need to be careful about ascribing to our governments a level of autonomy. This has been brought in sharp contrast. The economy drives the society, and the politics that we have is what money buys for us. I'm sorry to put it in such crude terms, but you've seen the example of in the United States of America, the most advanced, mature capitalist economy, where a businessman can buy an election and then run the country itself. And these are things we must take much more seriously. So I'm raising this as well. We must be careful also how we bandish about terms like democracy. If we say that the democracy that we are talking about really empowers the people through political systems to have the power, we must be careful in differentiating what coups generate itself. And colleagues would know what I'm speaking about. I'm not speaking in code here. If the regimes that existed prior continue neo-colonial lines, then I'm sorry, then the alternative to that is the people taking power. And what is the only institution that has remained strong across Africa? Because whether it's health that has been basically defunded through austerity and other methods, education, which the quality is very poor, the military has remained strong. So sometimes the only agency available to act on behalf of people have been military intervention. I'm saying this not in celebration of such activities, but it's because we have failed to have in place the mechanisms to exit those that continue and perpetuate our neo-colonial domination on the continent. Last one from me, and it's very important also to bear in mind, this time from a perspective on the east coast of our continent. And that is the more than a millennium experience of Indian Ocean integration. And here's where we have examples of trade, of exchange taking place between the original civilizational nodes in southern Africa, all the way to the northern parts of Asia. And, you know, this didn't involve slavery, this didn't involve exploitation in that form. But there's a giraffe in the zoo in Beijing, and we have some of the porcelain and glass beads in Mapamgubwe in southern Africa. And that shows us a very different world is possible and remains possible for us all.
All right, Dr. Maharaj, I'm going to come back to you very quickly, but let me ask Ijogi here on perhaps on a lighter note. By January 2024, the 6 newly admitted countries will be joining. Now, would it still be proper to call the organization, the alliance, as BRICS? Because BRICS at the moment is just an acronym for the 5 members who are in the alliance.
Well, let me start by also on a lighter note, thanking Dr. Maharaj for promoting me to a professor.
Congratulations.
Well, I think the branding of the nomenclature would just be, it's a simple thing, just BRICS plus. That's all. If you ask me on a lighter note.
Dr. Maharaj, do you think that should be the case?
You see, I'm very much supportive of this line as well. We mustn't get over-consumed, over-determine what a name is going to be. Let's concentrate on the practice,
Correct.
what's actually taking place. And that's what we need to be aligned with. So
I
I
agree.
like the vagueness of a BRICS plus. Why? Because that plus is going to grow to infinity.
Yeah.
When we have all 8.1 billion of us on the one side, we will see who's standing on the other side. I'm
Yeah.
also keeping it light along that note. Why? Because it cannot be that we continue these thousands of years continuing to perpetuate unequal exchange. We have learned much more. And because of it, we cannot then pass on to our children and their children our own material conditions of deprivation. This thing must stop in our generation. And here we have possibly a vehicle through which it's the strongest to date, colleagues. Yeah, it's not the best, it's not perfect, but then neither are any of us as human beings as well. So let's recognize that we have flaws. Working together, we have the opportunity of redressing those flaws themselves. Yeah, BRICS Plus is good enough as long as it makes the change in world systems.
All right, Mr. Jogi. Look, the communique from that summit is a booklet in itself.
It's huge.
A 94-point communique, one of the largest I've seen anywhere by any organization in recent times. Well, it addresses so many issues, one of which is the United Nations. And by the way, the UN General Secretary Guterres was at that summit in South Africa. And the alliance seems to criticize, or very clearly criticizes, the structure of the United Nations as it is today, and is seeking a reform of that system. Now, and I'm just wondering, it's not the first time that organizations, regional or sub-regional organizations like the African Union and the rest of them, the Commonwealth and others, have sought a reform of the UN system. How far can this go?
Well, it's a good thing that they've put it out there, because the UN was set up shortly after the Second World War. It is moribund, it is old, it is obsolete. The world has moved on. The political and economic interplay that you have, or you had post-World War II, they are completely different in 2023. Hence the need for a new world order. I don't like to use the word reset, because I have my own doubts about it, because I think that these global players and these world players are trying to play a game on Africans by calling it looking for a world reset. I just think that the United Nations need to be restructured. The power bases are shifting gradually. And the traditional mode of doing things, especially when it comes to governance, is changing. So I think that the world needs to talk about inclusion. If the Americans are shouting human rights, we should be shouting inclusion, especially in the United Nations. So I think that Africa needs to have a permanent seat at where the highest decisions are taken, for sure. So the call by these BRICS nations, who are very strong nations, I mean, China, India, Russia, they are very strong nations. I think if they can back the restructuring of the United Nations to be a place that will cater for better humanity. What it's doing now is just protecting the West. You have them, like you see what happened in Rwanda, what happened in Liberia, what happened in Algeria, and Libya, sorry. What was the role of the UN? They were only supporting NATO. So I think that we need a United Nations that is fair and just. It should not only be about protecting the West and impoverishing Africa, but it's about improving the world, as in for a better humanity. That's my take on it.
Are we seeing a rethink by, say, Russia, for instance, that is a permanent member of the UN the Security Council?
Yes.
These countries, these permanent members of the UN, have over time resisted what I would call the democratization of the Security Council.
they can't democratize because they are the benefactors. They are the victorious ones after the Second World War.
Yes.
So they can't
So
democratize.
are we seeing a Russia having a rethink of that
Yes,
as part
yes,
of BRICS now?
yes, they are. And they should, if you allow me, I'll say nominate Nigeria because we have the largest economy in Africa. We have the second largest, pardon my South African friend, we have the second largest economy in Africa. We have the largest population in Africa. And we represent that true thing that is Africa, that black, beautiful brown skin. So I think that if Russia can back any African nation, I think it should be Nigeria.
Okay, Dr. Maharaj, I know you are eager to throw in a word there, but quickly let me refer you to point number 10 of that communique, which says, and I quote, "We support a robust global financial safety net with a quota-based and adequately resourced International Monetary Fund (IMF) at its center. We call for the conclusion of the International Monetary Fund's 16th General Review of Quotas before 15 December 2023.
So, as you raise it itself, this is one of the issues that has run in parallel with the evolution of the BRICS itself. And there have been various initiatives seeking to redress that situation in terms of who makes the investment decisions on behalf of the International Monetary Fund, and hence the quotas that we speak about, how we are represented on that structure itself. So when we look at the actual behavior and practices, the bailouts that have taken place where the IMF has intervened have largely then led to deteriorating social conditions in the countries in which those bailout packages have been experienced, including places like Argentina, amongst others. Now, it's important bearing in mind the object of having such a facility is where the country ran into serious trouble. So in other words, if we use the example of a patient going into hospital, you would want to put in place mechanisms that afforded the patient the opportunity of improving their health such that they can walk out of the facility. You don't, when the patient is requiring treatment, add to their negative conditions. And in essence, the conditionalities of the IMF have largely constituted such a negative impact on those countries itself. So I think right across us looking at these institutions are geriatric now by definition, and therefore should be treated as such. Africa, however, has the largest majority of young people, young human beings of this planet, the majority of whom reside on our continent itself. The gap between the two is too large. Not only must we seek the reform of the United Nations in terms of its governance structure, but we also need to improve the quality of our representation currently. We have general assemblies that continue to vote, for example, against ending the economic unfair and completely unjust economic embargo on the peoples of Cuba. Other than 2 countries, the rest of the world has voted against it. Yet it continues and is being perpetuated, causing hardships and miseries. The same issue about NATO's intervention in Libya and what they've destroyed on our continent, and now us having to pick up the pieces as a consequence thereof. All of these decisions were taken by elites on behalf of elites itself. The democratization we speak about should offer a fair representation of humankind, not just in terms of economic privilege that's accumulated through this capitalist system of development. I reiterate what I said at the onset. There is no fairer capitalism itself, but we can use the embryonic form in this decaying corpse of capitalism to build a better world that we all need, want, and must increasingly articulate and demand in such fora, such as the United Nations, including the Security Council.
Antonio Guterres, is UN Secretary General at the summit in South Africa, said, and I quote, "Today's global governance structures reflect yesterday's world." What do you think he meant?
No, absolutely. I think our colleague, Professor Dr. Igochi, has mentioned this as well. That was the compromise here. Also bear in mind that the predecessor to the United Nations was the League of Nations. And one of the founding members of the League of Nations was an apartheid head of state, Jan Smuts. So that shows you the compromises that existed previously. Now in the 21st century, and as we're moving in the year 2023 forward, we are confronted by immense challenges, good colleagues. These are things right in front of us. We learned when our species being attacked us, when our species being was under attack by a virus, COVID-19. COVID did not come and check what passport you had. It was a virus that infected you because it was infecting human beings. So as a consequence, and we know increasing threat of such attacks is on the horizon. Together with that, climate change is wreaking incredible and massive dislocations. Migration is increasing at a massive scale. These are the types of issues that a proper world systems organization should be geared towards responding to. It cannot be that our brothers and sisters in Haiti continue under the conditions that they are living through at present, where we don't have a neutral enough body that has legitimacy amongst them, such that they would welcome such a peacekeeping force being induced. We need to do much more in terms of international rescue, such that with escalating natural calamities, we have the capacity to inform people of these new weather conditions, what it means for crop growing, right through to how we rescue ourselves during floods. There are many more challenges that call for global collaboration, cooperation, and through that enhancing and clarifying that we are but the last extent of our species occupying this planet. I want to again remind everyone connected with this program, we're not threatening the planet's future. We are threatening our future on the planet by continuing to use institutions and structures that are no longer capable of meeting our needs and demands. Therefore, we must move beyond merely reforming and towards transforming these institutions such that they are viable for the realities that confront us, not what's in the textbooks, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maharaj. But on a final note here, Jogi, the summit's communique talks about strengthening of disarmament and non-proliferation, including the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, and Stockpiling of Biological and Toxin Weapons. These are also weapons that are being produced by some members of the BRICS. Is that a contradiction in terms?
No, I don't think so. I think that even though they have a cache of armory of weapons, different kinds of weapons, I think that as the world is moving forward, better, stronger, the sensible and the diplomatic thing to do is to to decelerate stockpiling of arms, whether they are biological or whether they are, nuclear, because it would threaten our humanity and us as a people. I think that we should even add another, the deceleration of light weapons and ammunitions. I mean, we have been killing ourselves from the creation of this planet. We know better now. We know that in our DNA, we are all one. There's not the color of your skin is only skin deep. If you check our DNA, you know that we're all one human race. So we should decelerate the conflict and the violence that we have around the world. So I think that's the right way to go.
All right, thank you so much, Adakole Jogi. Professor Maharaj, one last word here. If you had the opportunity of advising the drivers of BRICS, what would you be telling them?
Well, I'd ask them, please, listen to the peoples of the country whose flags you fly. Those individuals doing driving are doing it on behalf of a larger constituency. And those are the views and values that need to be transmitted forward. We've had enough of elite pacting, which then seeks to separate these leaders from the rest of us. And that needs to also be redressed. The last point touching on, I fully support what Georgie has just raised. We should be mature enough today not to subscribe to mutually assured destruction. Look at the acronym, MAD. We are not insane. Let us encourage more sanity amongst all of us, more sobriety, and working together. We have a world to occupy and a whole range of issues to engage with collectively. This is also bringing an African sense of Ubuntu into the world and away from the narrow individualism that's basically wrecked us and torn us apart.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rasinga Maharaj, Founding Director, Institute for Economic Research on Innovation at the Tshwane University of Technology in South Africa. He's also the chairperson, Southern Africa Node on the Millennium Project. Thank you very much for joining us all the way from Johannesburg. And of course, right here in the studio, we had Adakole Ijogi, a political economist. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Gentlemen, we are most grateful for your time and indeed for sharing your knowledge with us. And to our viewers out there, I want to thank you for investing your time with us. Join us again when we bring you a fresh edition of the program, People, Politics, and Power. Bye for now.